Before this story begins, you are asked for a moment of your stillness. For what you are about to witness is not a tale of grand battles, nor of empires won and lost. It is the story of a quiet war, fought not on a field of conflict, but in the desolate, windswept space between two broken hearts. It is a story told in the language of silence, in the weight of a shared glance, in the warmth of a fire on a cold night. So I ask you to listen closely, not just with your ears, but with that part of you that understands the profound gravity of a hand reaching out in the darkness. Listen for the sound of a family being forged, not from blood, but from ash and necessity. This is a testament to the fact that sometimes, the greatest act of defiance is simply to survive, and the greatest act of love is to help someone else do the same. Now, let the story begin. She knew she was going to die here, on the frozen rind of a forgotten prairie. The wind, a razor of ice, sliced through her threadbare shawl, seeking the last vestiges of warmth from her body and from the tiny, still form clutched to her chest. Her name was Ilara, though the name felt like a relic from another life, a word belonging to a woman who had known shelter and food and the comfort of a husband's arm. That woman was gone, turned to dust like the parched earth beneath her. All that remained was a vessel of fear, hollowed out by grief, with one last, desperate duty, to shield her baby girl until the cold took them both. She had stopped crying hours ago. Tears were a luxury, a waste of precious heat. Now, there was only a dull, rhythmic rocking, a metronome counting down their final moments. It was then that she heard it, a sound apart from the wind's mournful song. The crunch of hooves on frosted soil. She did not look up. It made no difference. Whether it was a beast or a man, the end would be the same. The sound stopped. A shadow fell over her. He saw her from a distance, a dark smudge against the grey rock, a heap of rags that did not belong in the landscape of his solitude. Silas was a man who had intentionally erased himself from the world, retreating to this harsh expanse where the only voices were the wind and the ghosts of his own making. His first instinct, honed by years of isolation, was to ride on. The world and its sorrows were no longer his concern. He had paid his dues in tears and loss, and his heart was a barren field where nothing new would ever grow. He had already lost a child, a little girl with eyes the color of the summer sky, and the memory was a permanent winter within him. He nudged his horse forward, ready to leave the unfortunate soul to her fate. But then, the bundle of rags in her arms shifted. A tiny, pale hand, no bigger than a leaf, emerged from the folds. Silas pulled back on the reins so sharply his horse tossed its head in protest. He stared, his breath catching in his throat, a ghost of a ghost. The world, which he had so successfully held at bay, had just thrown a piece of his own shattered past directly into his path. He slid from the saddle, his movements stiff and reluctant. He approached not as a savior, but as a man walking toward a memory he could not outrun. He said nothing. Words were useless things, artifacts of a life of connection he had long since abandoned. He uncorked his water skin and held it out. The woman, Ilara, finally lifted her head. Her eyes were vacant, chasms of despair. But when she saw the offering, a flicker of something primal and protective surfaced. She took the water skin, her hand trembling violently, and pressed it not to her own cracked lips, but to the baby's. Silas watched, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He had not intended to save her? He had only intended to give water to a child. He did not yet realize that, in the unforgiving calculus of the wild, it was the exact same thing. He took them back to his cabin, a structure as stark and functional as the man himself. It was a single room of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, containing little more than a cot, a stone hearth, and the tools of survival. There were no comforts here, no softness, only the brutal honesty of an existence stripped to its essentials. He gestured for Ilara to take the corner farthest from the door, a space of relative shelter from the drafts. He laid down a thick, worn buffalo hide, its surface smooth with age. It was a bed, a promise of insulation against the biting cold, and nothing more. He did not speak to her, did not ask for her name or her story. Her story was written in the hollows of her cheeks and the terror that lived in her eyes. He had no desire to read it. His own grief was a library he could never escape, and he had no room for more volumes. For 2 days, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the small space. Silas moved with a relentless, solitary purpose, chopping wood, mending tack, cleaning his rifle. He was a creature of routine, and their presence was a disruption he tolerated with a clenched jaw. Ilara remained on the buffalo hide, a wraith-like figure holding her baby, Lena, so tightly it seemed they were a single being. She watched his every move, her gaze darting and fearful, like a trapped animal assessing its cage. She barely ate the food he left for her, a piece of hardtack, a strip of salted meat, as if she believed she didn't deserve it. On the second night, Silas noticed the food was untouched. He rose from his cot in the dead of night, the fire embers casting long, dancing shadows. He walked over to where she slept, her body curled protectively around the child. He took a piece of smoked jerky from his own private stash, the tenderest part, and placed it silently beside her hand. He returned to his cot and lay awake, staring into the darkness. It was not an act of kindness. It was, he told himself, an act of maintenance. A tool, to be useful, must be maintained. And for reasons he refused to examine, these two souls had just become his unwilling, unspoken responsibility. The first snows arrived, not as a gentle dusting, but as a vanguard of the brutal winter to come. The flakes fell thick and fast, clinging to the pines and blanketing the world in a pristine, merciless white. Silas knew this land. He knew the coming season was not a thing to be weathered, but a predator to be outmaneuvered. His small cabin, which had for years been a sufficient fortress for one man and his memories, now felt like a trap. It was not large enough to house his ghosts and these two living, breathing interlopers. He could not stay. And yet, as he looked at Ilara, who was watching the snow fall with a renewed sense of dread, he understood he could not leave them behind either. They were a burr caught on his soul, and he had no choice but to carry them with him. He made his decision in silence, as he did all things. The next morning, he began to pack, his movements economical and decisive. He loaded his sturdiest mule with supplies, flour, salt, ammunition, and a small tent. He was preparing for a journey, not a short one. Ilara watched, her fear coiling in her stomach. Was he leaving them? The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. But then he walked over to an old wooden chest, a relic from his past life that he never opened. He lifted the lid and pulled out a pair of women's boots. They were worn, but the leather was thick and well-oiled, the sole sturdy. They had belonged to his wife. He walked over to Ilara and, without a word, set them down in front of her. The gesture was more profound than any promise. It was a piece of his history, a sacred object, and he was giving it to her. It meant she was coming. It meant she would be shod for the hard miles ahead. Later, he took strips of leather and a piece of canvas and fashioned a carrier for the baby, Lena. He adjusted the straps, fitting it to his own broad chest. He would carry the child. He had taken on the burden, made it his own. They set out as the snow fell, heading not east towards civilization, but deeper west, into the jagged, unforgiving teeth of the mountains. He was heading for a hidden valley he knew of, a place of sanctuary so remote the world would never find them. The journey was a crucible, forging them in silence and hardship. They walked for days, a slow procession against a vast, indifferent wilderness. Silas led, breaking the trail through the deepening snow, the baby Lena nestled against his chest in the carrier he had made. Her warmth was a strange and unfamiliar sensation against his heart, a faint ember in a chamber long gone cold. Ilara followed in his footsteps, the sturdy boots he'd given her a constant, solid presence on the treacherous ground. He did not speak, but he became her teacher. He taught her through action, not words. When they made camp, he would gather a specific type of bark for tinder, leaving a piece of it where she could see. The next night, she would find some herself. He would point to the sky, a single, sharp gesture at a ring around the moon, and the next day a storm would hit. She learned to read the land by reading him. She was an astute observer, her survival instincts sharpened by trauma. She watched how he moved, how he listened, how he conserved every ounce of energy. She began to mimic him, her movements becoming more efficient, her gaze more focused. One night, the unearthly howl of a wolf pack echoed through the valley, chillingly close. Ilara flinched, an involuntary shudder running through her as she pulled Lena's blanket tighter. She sat rigid by the fire, her eyes wide in the flickering light, every muscle tense for a threat she could not see. Silas, who was cleaning his rifle on the other side of the fire, saw her terror. He said nothing. He simply finished his task, stood up, and moved his bedroll from its customary spot. He laid it out on the ground between her and the direction of the howling. He placed himself, his body, his presence, as a literal shield. He did not offer empty reassurances. His action was the only reassurance that mattered. That night, for the first time since her husband's death, Ilara slept through until morning. The wolves still howled, but there was a wall between her and the sound. They came to a river, a wide, shallow artery of water so cold it seemed to steal the very air above it. Ice clung to the rocks like sugar crust. Silas crossed first, testing the footing, then turned to help her. He took her hand, his grip firm and impersonal. Halfway across, her foot slipped on a slick, moss-covered stone. She fell with a sharp, involuntary cry, not of words, but of pure pain. Her ankle twisted beneath her. Instantly, he was there, lifting her with an ease that belied his lean frame. He carried her the rest of the way to the bank and set her down gently. Without a word, he knelt and carefully removed the boot, his touch methodical and surprisingly gentle as he probed the swelling joint. It was a bad sprain, but not broken. Back at their makeshift camp, he built up the fire and went to work. He soaked strips of cloth in the near-boiling water from their cookpot, wringing them out and applying them to her ankle with a practiced efficiency that spoke of a past filled with such injuries. She sat on the buffalo hide, watching his hands. They were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who wrestled his living from the earth, yet they moved with a surgeon's precision. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. When he was finished, the bandage neat and tight, he started to pull away. Ilara, the word was a whisper, raspy from disuse, but it cut through the silence of the wilderness. It was the first word she had spoken to him. He stopped. He didn't turn around immediately, but he stilled, absorbing the sound. He finally gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He had acknowledged her. He had received her name. A few moments later, as he added wood to the fire, he glanced over at the sleeping baby. Ilara's voice came again, a little stronger this time. Lena, another nod. That was all. But a profound shift had occurred. The vast, empty silence that had stretched between them for weeks was no longer a void. It was now populated by two names, small but significant anchors in the lonely expanse of their shared world. Days later, on the verge of starvation and with their supplies dwindling to almost nothing, they saw a thread of smoke rising from a distant chimney. It led them to a trading post, a solitary log building hunkered down in a grove of aspens, looking as weary and isolated as they felt. As they approached, the door creaked open and a woman emerged, a rifle held loosely in the crook of her arm. She was older, her face a roadmap of hard winters and solitude, her eyes sharp and assessing. This was Martha, a woman who had carved out her own existence on the fringes of the world and trusted no one on sight. She watched Silas and Ilara approach, her gaze lingering on the man's hard face, the woman's haunted eyes, and the baby bundled on his chest. Silas dismounted, moving slowly, his hands in plain sight. He offered no greeting, just unstrapped a bundle of prime beaver pelts from his mule. "Trade," he said, his voice a low gravel. Martha nodded, her eyes never leaving them. She took the pelts, her expert hands judging their worth. As Silas gathered supplies, flour, beans, salt, a small block of lard, Martha's gaze fixed on Ilara. "She your kin?" she asked, her tone pragmatic and devoid of pleasantry. Silas paused, his back to her. The question hung in the cold air. What was she to him? A burden? A responsibility? A ghost? He turned, his expression unreadable. "She's with me," he said, the words carefully chosen. They were a statement of fact, not of relation. Martha looked from him to Ilara, who stood silently, clutching her own arms, looking at the ground. Martha saw the whole story in that posture. She saw the fear, the dependence, and the fragile, unspoken tether that bound these two broken people together. Her face softened almost imperceptibly. She went back into the post and returned with an extra sack of flour and a thick, heavy woolen blanket. "Winter's a killer out here," she said, her voice gruffer than her action. "You'll need this." It was an act of charity, but more than that, it was an act of recognition. She had seen the invisible thing they were building between them and, in her own wary way, she had given it her blessing. As Silas secured the new supplies to the mule, Martha leaned against the doorframe of her post, her expression turning serious. "You should know," she began, her voice low, "there were riders through here a week ago. Lawmen from the territory." Silas stopped what he was doing, his body going still. He didn't look at her, but she knew he was listening to every word. "They were asking questions," Martha continued. "Looking for a woman. A widow, they said. With a newborn child. Said she ran from the settlement down south after her husband took sick and passed. Claimed she wasn't in her right mind." She paused, letting the words sink in. "They weren't asking like they were trying to help. They were asking like they were hunting something that belonged to them." Ilara, who had been standing near the horse, overheard. The color drained from her face, and her hand went instinctively to her throat. The world she had fled was reaching for her, its impersonal rules and judgment stretching across the wilderness to drag her back. They would not see a survivor who had found an unlikely protector. They would see a mentally unstable woman and a feral mountain man who had taken her. They would separate them, sending her to an institution and Lena to an orphanage. The law, in its blind attempt to restore order, would destroy the one fragile sanctuary she had found. Silas's jaw tightened. The intrusive world, with its faceless enforcers, was now a tangible threat. He had sought this solitude to be left alone, but the world refused to cooperate. He looked at Ilara, at the raw terror in her eyes, and a cold, hard resolve settled in his chest. She was not a straggler for the law to reclaim. She was not a case to be closed. His protection, which had begun as a reluctant impulse, now became a conscious, defiant choice. He finished securing the supplies with quick, angry movements. "Thank you," he said to Martha, the two words carrying the weight of a much longer conversation. He swung himself into the saddle, reached down a hand for Ilara, and pulled her up to sit behind him. They left the trading post at a trot, pushing deeper, faster, into the wild. They were no longer just traveling. They were now fugitives. They found it after another week of hard travel, the valley Silas had been searching for. It was a bowl of land cradled by sheer granite cliffs on three sides, accessible only by a single, narrow pass that could be easily defended. A clear, fast-running stream cut through a meadow of high grass, and the slopes were thick with pine and aspen. It was a fortress built by nature, a place so secluded it felt like the world's last secret. Here, they stopped running. Here, they would make their stand. The work of building began immediately, a frantic race against the deepening winter. It was in this shared, urgent labor that their bond, tempered on the trail, was finally forged into something solid and lasting. He taught her how to build a life from nothing. With his axe, he showed her how to fell the slender pines, how to strip them, and how to notch the logs so they would fit together snugly. She, in turn, learned to mix the mud and dry grass for the chinking that would seal the walls against the wind. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and strong. She worked alongside him, their movements falling into a silent, efficient rhythm. There was no master and apprentice, there were only two people working for their collective survival. She learned to set his snares along the game trails, her patience and quiet observation making her a natural. She learned to skin a rabbit with a steady hand, to salt the meat, to cure the hide. And as they built their shelter, Lena grew. She learned to crawl on the packed earth floor, her small hands patting the ground that her mother and this quiet, solemn man were turning into a home. One evening, as the cabin was nearing completion, Silas sat by the fire, carving a piece of scrap wood with his knife. Ilara watched as a small, delicate bird took shape under his skilled fingers. When he was done, he sanded it smooth with a piece of sandstone and held it out, not to her, but to Lena. The baby took it in her chubby fist, gurgling with delight. Elara looked at Silas, at his face illuminated by the firelight, and for the first time, she saw past the grief and the solitude. She saw the man beneath. "Thank you," she said, and this time, the words were not a whisper. They were full, clear, and steady, a statement of gratitude that encompassed more than just the wooden toy. It was for the boots, the shelter, the protection. It was for everything. The intrusive world found them, as they always knew it might. It came in the form of two riders, their figures dark against the snow at the entrance to the valley. They wore thick coats and the dull glint of tin badges marked them as lawmen. They rode with an air of weary righteousness, men convinced of the absolute morality of their task. They were not villains, not in their own minds. They were simply the agents of a world that demanded order, a world that could not comprehend, let alone tolerate, the strange, wild family they had found. They reined in their horses a respectful distance from the newly built cabin. Silas was outside, splitting firewood. He did not stop his work, but every muscle in his body was coiled. He watched them from the corner of his eye. Elara, who had been inside, appeared in the doorway, her face pale but her expression resolute. She held Lena on her hip. One of the lawmen, a portly man with a thick mustache, dismounted. "Silas," he said, his voice carrying in the still, cold air. He knew his name. They had done their homework. "We're not here for trouble. We've come for the woman." Elara, he directed his next words to her, his tone patronizingly gentle. "We've been looking for you a long time. The town council has arranged for your care. We're here to take you back to civilization." They saw a broken victim and her rough captor. They saw an impropriety that needed correcting. But Elara was no longer the silent, terrified woman they had been told about. She took a breath, stepped out from the protection of the doorway, and stood beside Silas. She looked the lawman directly in the eye. "My home is here," she said, her voice shaking only slightly, but filled with an unshakable conviction. The lawman's face tightened. "With all due respect, this is no place for a woman and a child. This isn't proper." He took a step forward. Silas finally spoke. He set his axe down slowly, deliberately. His voice was low, flat, and carried the weight of absolute finality. "You heard the lady." He looked from one lawman to the other. "This is her home." He paused, and then delivered the lie that was truer than any fact. "And I'm her husband." The word stunned the lawmen into silence. They had come expecting to rescue a damsel, not to confront a family. They saw the sturdy cabin, the neat stack of firewood, the plumes of smoke rising from the chimney. They saw the defiant man and the woman standing by his side, not behind him. They saw a life, built with purpose. After a long, tense moment where the only sound was the wind in the pines, the lawman gave a curt nod, turned, and remounted his horse. Without another word, they wheeled their horses around and rode away, leaving the valley to its silence and its secrets. Winter arrived in full, burying the valley in a deep, pristine blanket of snow. It was not a force of opposition anymore, but one of insulation. The snow sealed the narrow pass, muffled the world, and locked them into the sanctuary they had built with their own four hands. The threat of the outside world, of riders and their righteous laws, receded, becoming a distant memory. They were safe. They were alone. They were free. Their days fell into a quiet, peaceful rhythm, dictated by the needs of survival and the simple fact of their shared existence. They tended their snares, chopped wood, maintained the cabin. The silence between them was no longer the heavy, fearful thing it had been on the trail. It was a comfortable, living quiet, filled with unspoken understanding. It was the silence of two people who knew each other's movements, who could anticipate each other's needs without a word. One night, a blizzard raged outside, the wind howling like the wolves of their memory. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth crackled, casting a warm, golden glow on the log walls. Silas sat on a stool he had made, watching Elara as she rocked a sleeping Lena in her arms, humming a soft, wordless lullaby. The lie he had told the lawmen, "I'm her husband," hung in the warm air between them. It was a fiction that had saved them, but it had also solidified a truth that had been growing all along. Ilara looked up, her song fading, and met his gaze across the small room. In his eyes, she no longer saw the haunted, solitary man who had found her at the edge of death. She saw a protector, a partner, a father to her child. In her eyes, he no longer saw a broken, traumatized victim. He saw a resilient, strong woman, a survivor who had helped him build a home not just from logs and mud, but from the ruins of their respective pasts. He had lost a family to tragedy. She had lost a family to sickness and abandonment. And here, in the heart of a world that had tried to tear them apart, they had found one. He reached out, his calloused hand gently resting on Lena's downy head. Ilara leaned into the touch slightly, a quiet, profound gesture of acceptance, of trust, of belonging. The war was over. The journey was done. They were home.